Hi, I'm Tim Naftali. I'm director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library Museum in Yorba Linda, California. It's December 3rd, 2008, and I have the great honor and privilege to be interviewing Justice Stephen Breyer for the Nixon Oral History Program. Justice Breyer, thank you for doing this.
Pleasure.
How did you come to join the Watergate Special Prosecution Force?
The reason I was there, and I was only there really for a summer and part of the fall, was because part of their mandate was to look into what was known as the Dida Beard memo. The Dida Beard memo was a memo that Dida Beard had written to her superior at the ITT Corporation, which said, our noble commitment, which was the commitment of ITT to help underwrite through the Sheraton Hotels, the Republican convention, our noble commitment went a long way towards getting the administration to call off an antitrust case against ITT. It didn't quite say that. It said, Louis told me, R.E., you see, I can remember it to this day. Louis told me, R.E., our noble commitment, that it helped get the antitrust case called off. Now, Louis was Louis Nunn, who was a fundraiser. And it was possible he told her that, though it wasn't possible that it was true. It wasn't true. But in any case, that memo led to a Senate investigation. That Senate investigation, at some point, led people to think there might be some connection with the Watergate. And so Archie Cox was asked to look into that in part. I was a professor of antitrust at Harvard. Jim Vorenberg saw me wandering around one day and said, you're just the person we need to look into that part of the mandate for the investigation. And would you help organize it? Of course, I jumped at that chance. I thought it would be terrific, and it was very, very interesting. I went down there that summer and helped get that part of the organization, part of the mandate, organized and under control. So I worked nonstop during the summer. There were other people brought in, Conley and what's his name? Oh, God, forget it. Sorry. Cut this part of the interview out. I don't want him to know I having trouble. But there were a couple of other people that came in and then carried on. And then in the fall, I went back up to Harvard and came down from time to time.
I've interviewed Charles Colson about his investigation of the memo. The White House wanted to figure out if it was a fraud.
The memo?
Forgery. Yeah.
No, it wasn't. Everything in that memo was true. I could show every single thing. I interviewed all the people, and we went through that, and it was totally true. But the implication that was given was not true, because later on, I think the report said this, that to call off the investigation, the person who called off the case and settled the case, it wasn't calling it off, it was settling it, was McLaren, who was head of the antitrust division. And nobody thought that he had done anything dishonest. He hadn't. He was a totally honest person. He was left alone, and he operated independently.
And he didn't know anything about the San Diego?
No, I don't think so.
Oh.
I don't think so. That's my recollection of it now. And it's filled with irony, that part of the case. Why? Because the reason, what had happened, this is my recollection many, many years later, is I think that Harold Janine, who was the head of IT&T, and maybe Dida Beard, but some other people with him, went around and saw all the people in the White House and said, this case against us is totally against the Republicans' policy on antitrust. Their policy at that time, which was a plausible policy, certainly a reasonable policy, was you should not have the theory bigness is bad. That should not be the theory of antitrust, and many people agree with that theory of antitrust. It was not an unreasonable theory. And what Janine was arguing to these people who knew nothing about antitrust is that the division, the antitrust division, is violating that policy. And they're using a lot of words to fool people, but really they're violating it. Now, I guess, since I was a professor, I would have thought at that time, if somebody had been telling me that, I would have called in Phil Arita, or a professor of antitrust, someone who's a good Republican and a very good expert, and said, who's telling the truth, if I wanted to know. They didn't. They gave that job to Eagle Krogh, who also knew nothing about antitrust. And so Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman gave the job to Eagle Krogh to look into who's telling the truth. Well, of course, they went to the people. I used to work in the division. I know who they were. And these people talked to them about all the different theories which are plausible and so forth. And they couldn't evaluate it because they didn't have that experience. And that led, I think, to probably the people around the president becoming very unhappy because they couldn't figure out exactly what was going on. They became frustrated, and that may have led to the president having called Mr. Kleindienst and just been very annoyed.
And then, I think the story goes on that Mitchell then says, well, Griswold will resign.
That's possible, you see, because again, they're thinking of it as leave the antitrust division alone. Let them to pursue the cases that they think. At the same time, Janine is not without a good argument. He's saying what they're doing is, when you do that, is they're violating what is basically your policy or the policy of the party. And then they're trying to figure out, it's a kind of irony upon irony, because they got a settlement that wasn't a bad settlement. It's very arguably correct that they were pursuing a policy of bigness is bad under various guises. It may be Janine was right. It may be President Nixon was right. But they went about it in this way that led to people not telling the truth in front of a Senate committee and causing all kinds of trouble. So I find it ironic because I think, first of all, McLaren and the Antitrust Division, my recollection of that investigation is that what was written about it later was right. They were completely honest. And they resented the intrusion from the White House. And it's quite possible that Erwin Griswold did get very unhappy and said that we can't have the president intervening case by case. And there we are. It's like some kind of Russian novel, and one thing leads to another, and everything gets slightly mixed up, and before you know it, everyone gets into trouble.
Well, there are several stories from that era that fit into this category, but of course the other irony is that Archibald Cox, who was criticized by the White House for being close to Kennedy and therefore an enemy, should actually in this case, his investigation, thanks to you, concluded that the White House had not done anything wrong in this instance.
That's right. Well, thanks to me and other people. But Archie was not, he's a totally honest person. He's one of the most honest people I've ever met. When he would lead that group, the question was, what are the facts? How do the facts play into rules of ethics or rules of law? And I treasure the note I got from him when I left there because he thought I'd done the job well. Well to him means you find out what happened, you talk to people under oath, some of them, and you get the details right. And when you get the details right as to what actually happened and who was thinking what and why they said it, then that can be put together into a coherent set of categories so you understand the situation and can make a judgment about whether there was a violation of law or whether there wasn't, about whether there was something unethical or whether there wasn't. And you can't do that without knowing the underlying story. And the ethos that he spread through that organization was your job is to get the facts, to find out, not to make prejudgments, and to end up basing your judgments on what is learned. It was exactly the opposite of any kind of vendetta, the opposite of that. It was, we're here to do our job, and that's what Archie was like. He was a person who, Holmes talked about what he used to call jobmanship, was the person who did his job. You do your job right. And our job is not to be in politics. Our job here in this office is non-political. It is to find out what happened. And that's what he did. And that was and I remember, in fact, after the Saturday Night Massacre, the best story, the best revelation, the best account of what Archie was like, the most revealing to me is the talk that he gave. And I look at that occasionally. I've looked at it since then.
The press conference.
Yes, the press conference. And he said here, well, I've thought from time to time maybe I'm getting too big for my britches. After all, it's the President of the United States who's involved in this. But Archie thought, I'm doing this job. Here is why I wanted these tapes. And he expected that when people hear the reasons and hear a reasonable explanation, then they'll be satisfied. And I think ultimately that's what happened. And you don't have to have conspiracy theories on things. Conspiracy theories, in my experience, are almost always wrong. Usually life proceeds to make its mistakes through some kind of misunderstanding or stupidity or people not paying attention to other people's points of view. Don't need a conspiracy theory. And Archie was the last one who would have been thinking of such a thing. He wants to know what happened, period.
You were in Cambridge during the Saturday Night Massacre, were you?
I think I was, and I think I must have come down to a couple of days later, because I have a recollection of being there when Judge Bork walked in, and Kitch was with him, Ed Kitch. And I remember thinking to myself, the others were there because I know they gave, Archie told them, stay here and do your job. This is not a moment for dramatic gestures. Stay. Your job is to investigate, to find out what happened, to draw the appropriate conclusions. So just do it. It doesn't matter if it's me, says Archie, or some other person who is in charge. Do the job. And I knew that Judge Bork was there, and he thought there was something not right about whatever he thought. I thought he doesn't understand. That was my thinking, in my mind. He just doesn't understand this situation. He doesn't understand what the office has been trying to do. And if only he understood it, he wouldn't feel the way he does.
For students who know nothing about this, could you explain what the office was trying to do?
What they had a mandate. And the mandate was to find out certain things about what happened to see if the laws were violated. That was there. That's what the special prosecutor was there for. The Attorney General had promised the Senate, when he was confirmed, that there would be a special prosecutor as an independent person who would look into the situation, the accusations about Watergate, and to see if laws were violated. And if so, who violated them? And prosecute those if there had been some that had been violated. And that's what he did. A good investigator, a good lawyer. That's what Archie was. He was a fabulous lawyer, in the best sense of being a good lawyer, in the sense of you find out the facts, you are careful, you don't go beyond what you find justified in the situation. And that's what he did. I mean, I've known him a long time. Very few people I admire more. I can't think of anybody, because he was a really admirable person because of he was intelligent, but he combined that intelligence with a good sense of the law, of doing a job, which I've said 5 times, and also an extraordinary honesty. That's why everyone admired him so much.
The risk of asking you to break a confidence, did he talk to you after the massacre about his opinion of Elliot Richardson? Was he a little disappointed in Richardson?
No, he didn't talk to me, so I don't know.
Did you hear anything about, as someone who knew him, were you at all brought into discussions about the Stennis Compromise or anything?
No, you see, I had a very peripheral, and I was an assistant Watergate special prosecutor, of which I am very proud. But I would not say I had a very high position in this organization. I had this area where I was working. My brother then was involved in this too, because independently he got hired as a lawyer there, and he was part of the Plumbers Task Force, which I think Merrill wasn't he the head of that? What's his name? I can't remember his name. Could you, again for students, tell them a little bit about the climate in the country after the Saturday Night Massacre? What was the effect of Archibald Cox? I think the effect of that was to galvanize opinion against President Nixon. And I think that the effect of that is Archie was doing his job honestly. He explained to people what he was doing. And so the average person would think, well, why was he dismissed? What's the reason for this? And so it didn't look very good for President Nixon, because it looked as if he was trying to prevent something from being revealed that might be significant. So that was the atmosphere. And the important thing, I think, for the Watergate office is stay calm. As I said, stay calm. I'm not in a position to make a dramatic statement about anything when I'm working in that office. I am an employee. It is my job to go and do the investigative and legal work. I've said that about several times. I want you to see how important that atmosphere was. any sort of excitement about this, and this is the president, he's done something wrong, and we're going to find out. Any attitude like that is out of place.
It was an unusual moment in American history.
Yes, it was. It was, and as I said, looking back at it, it's filled with misunderstandings and unfortunate, I think, behavior. One of the things I have to say that I've sort of admired in the way that the situation was responded to. I was, during that summer, my wife and children were in England, she was English, and I was staying with Phil Hyman, who is the number 3 person, who's a good friend, who is in the Watergate force. Mm-hmm. And we both shared we were at Mrs. Burling's house. I think she gave us a room for the summer, or 2 rooms or whatever. And so we were staying there. We go into work every morning. And a couple of things we wondered. We said, well, what if you step back? Which parts of these accusations and so forth you think are the worst? We thought probably the worst parts were the parts about sending people into the offices of Dan Ellsberg and efforts made by some of these plumbers, at least reportedly, to have some kind of physical attack on people. That's pretty bad. But then we said, well, if you were President Nixon and the tapes had been subpoenaed, mm-hmm. what would you do to avoid giving them? And we thought probably the best thing to do would be not to answer and just write a letter and say, I'm President of the United States, I'm very sorry, I cannot respond to a single district court judge because it's my job as president to keep the files or to be in charge of information. And at that point, there would have been an issue, but it would have been a single district court judge against the President of the United States. And there would have been nothing to appeal, you see, because the Archie would have won. The judge would have issued the subpoena or issued an order saying turn them over. And then what would Archie then do? Would he have to go and ask for contempt? I mean, it was quite complicated. Can you hold
a president in contempt?
Yeah, you see. So it was quite complicated. But the president didn't do that. No. Instead, he responded and said, you have no power. At that point, there created an issue. And so that issue could be brought to the Supreme Court. And then when it's brought to the Supreme Court, at that point, if the president lost, which he did, there's much more authority and political weight on the side of his having to turn them over. Years later, I see Charlie Wright, who was representing the president. And so I said this to him, just as I said it to you, and I said, you know, I've often wondered, why didn't the president follow that route of just not, there is historical precedent with Andrew Johnson. And, I said, why didn't he do that? And Charlie Wright said, because we knew it would be the wrong thing to do. It would be wrong to try to defeat a rule of law in that way. I mean, yes, I can right, good for him.
Yeah.
Good for him. So that would have created a terrible situation of the president against the court system. Do you see
yes,
the
kind of, absolutely.
And so Charlie said that he and I knew him fairly. I'm sure he was telling the truth on this. He said that they had discussed it. It wasn't something that hadn't occurred to them. And they had discussed it and decided that the right way to respond would have been to respond in the way they did, to answer the court and to say, we think you're legally wrong. So I admire that decision, although ultimately it was worked very much to the disadvantage.
Well, they had such an expansive view of executive
yes,
privilege.
They thought they would win on the law. But you see, they did choose a route through law.
Yes.
And of course, as a lawyer and as a judge and somebody who thinks that's very important for the country, I'm very glad that they made that decision.
Well, as you know, Archibald Cox is fired because they feel like they've hit a dead end following the route of the law.
Well, you say, did they? Maybe he thought he had the right to fire him. If he's right that they could fire him, and that was their view, that's still a different thing. He says, I have the legal right to fire him, so if I'm going to fire him, fine. Then there's a political consequence to that.
Yes, so yes, not a legal one, but a political one. Mm-hmm. Do you think that Do you think the case law would have been stronger if the House had sued the president for the tapes?
I don't know if the House can sue the president for the tapes. I don't know. Or no, I don't think so. People would say, I mean, I have no idea. You're asking very hypothetical questions.
No, I didn't.
A reaction to that is that people in general don't expect that as soon as you get the House of Representatives against the president, people think it's a political issue.
Well, what's interesting
What was interesting here is it went through a totally legal route, and eventually the Supreme Court says that the prosecutor is entitled to the tape. Well, it's in a way, if you think back to what President Eisenhower did in 57, 58, Little Rock, where the question in Little Rock was about whether the governor, who didn't want to desegregate the schools, whether he could defy the law. And he had the militia on his side, the state militia. And Eisenhower decided to send federal troops, the 101st Airborne Division. And at that point, I think the country faced up to the question of, in the South particularly, do we want to defy the rule of law? And the answer was no. It was a close question in the South. But the answer ultimately was no. Now, that's a very important decision for the country. It means that a rule of law is going to win, even when it's unpopular.
Well,
and so then 20 years later, or 15 years later, we have a situation where that rule of law is strong enough that the president will not put himself in the position of not following the law. And subsequently, with getting the tapes, it goes, as I said, to the Supreme Court. At that point, the Supreme Court says, turn over the tapes. And he does it. He's going to do it.
It was a very important moment.
Yes, yes. And he could not, because of the state of the American public believes in this rule of law, and they're right. But that's not something that just happened magically. It's something that there's a long, long history behind.
It was a test of our political culture, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was, but it's not perhaps. I think the real test was the desegregation in Little Rock. And I think that was where it was touch and go. And I think the law won out. Very good thing. And then by the time of Watergate, it's very interesting. You see, all of that, I think, is part of Charlie Wright's thinking, too. It's important, even here, you see, where probably President Nixon is thinking everyone else is wrong and he's right, or whatever. People normally do think that, you know. They think they're right and everybody else is wrong. I think that. We all think that.
It's human.
Yeah, it is human. So he's thinking, he decides still, I'm going to follow this law. I'll go to court, then if I lose, I abide by the result. So nobody notices that. But that's what's so important about this, in part, from a lawyer's point of view, and I think ultimately from the public's point of view.
No, without a doubt. That's why this is a great case to teach. A couple of smaller questions. Did you interview Dida Beard?
No, she was in the hospital. I remember there was something, she was in the hospital. We went, no, it was, where was she? She'd had a heart attack or something. I don't think I interviewed Dida Beard. I think that, but I did interview Miriam, I remember, and I interviewed several of the officials of the firm, and then compared interviewing them. And if you compared what the facts were, as I think we found them, with what they said in Congress under oath, when you read it, it sounds as if they're being awfully, evasive and so forth. They were, but they didn't lie. And then those who were prosecuted seemed very straightforward. They were straightforward, but they weren't telling the truth.
But there had been no wrongdoing. Why on earth?
Oh, no, there were people prosecuted. Wasn't Kleindienst prosecuted for that?
Oh, yeah. Well, he had. Yes. He had lied about the conversation with the president.
That's the point. And during the investigation, there were people who were very straightforward, and they didn't tell the truth. Now, again, you see why it's complicated. I imagine that his motive was he was trying to protect the president.
Yes. He was lying about a conversation that ultimately would not have put the president in jeopardy.
Yeah, that's right.
I was just wondering, because you know that E. Howard Hunt interviewed Dida Beard.
I remember calling Howard Hunt's office and getting through to him. We had some questions on Howard Hunt. that he might have been able to answer, and it turned out he couldn't. But it's Davis, it's Richie Davis and Connolly who came in, and I'd set this thing out, and they really pursued it through the rest of the year, and it was they who brought the prosecutions eventually.
I was going to ask you about the legacy of Watergate, but I think you've answered that. It's the rule of law, isn't it?
I think so. I think so. I think it's important that yes, it is.
Students looking at that era, what did it teach us about executive privilege?
Well, there is an executive privilege. Like all other privileges, like Holmes said that. He said that you have a principle of law, and at some point it runs into a contrary principle. The further you get away from its purpose, the more likely it is to find a contrary principle that defeats it. So executive privilege is a necessary and important part of the law to protect the confidentiality of the president's deliberations and getting advice from his own advisors. But it was being used in that instance well beyond the heart of what it's there for. So it isn't surprising that the court said it doesn't protect these particular materials.
My one question about Justice Goldberg, you were his second clerk.
Third.
Third clerk?
Third year. This is the third year. He had, the first year was Peter Edelman and David Filperoff. The second year was Alan Dershowitz and Lee McTurnan. And the third year was Steve Goldstein and me. That was his last year.
His last year. Did he talk to you about, did he tell you why he was leaving the court?
Oh, I do know something about that if you're interested.
I'm very interested.
I've learned a lot over the years on that. I was there when he left, or he was just about to leave. Dorothy Goldberg, his wife, said to, I remember her saying to me that she was against his leaving. And she said, if you ever are a member of the Supreme Court, don't quit. Well, I didn't think I would be a member of the Supreme Court, but that I'm not quitting, and it turns out I am a member. But we loved Arthur Goldberg. He was a wonderful person. He was an enthusiast. He was happiest probably when he was at the Labor Department. He wasn't unhappy at the court, but as Secretary of Labor, we'd see what he would be doing. I mean, he had the first day, he had task force going on minimum wage, on ending segregation in the trades unions, in the government. He had 5 different task forces going all the time. And Jack Kennedy, I was told, and believe it, thought that Arthur Goldberg was probably the smartest man he had met. And Kennedy, because he showed us this, Kennedy was president, he'd have Arthur Goldberg doing all kinds of things. He'd be looking at defense bases. He'd be helping him in 1,000 different ways. So he loved being in the executive branch. Here, he may have found it a little dull. He didn't seem unhappy. He was wonderful to his clerks. We'd have lunch with him every Saturday, because people worked on Saturday then at the court. What I think happened, this is only one person's view of it, but there's enough to, is that one day, Ken Galbraith, whom I knew pretty well, comes to see Arthur Goldberg. And they're talking, and Goldberg is complaining, this is sort of dull, you know, we have our, he's complaining. Now, Goldberg then forgets this. But that very afternoon, Ken Galbraith is talking to Jack Valenti, who's at the White House. And he says, you know, Arthur Goldberg really doesn't like this job very much. I think you ought to find something else for him, something like that. So Valenti told me this. So he talked to the president and said, well, we'll find something. Well, we need a new secretary of HEW, because the secretary of HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, had just retired. And I know this because Arthur Goldberg came into our office and said, I don't understand. He said, you know, in this administration, they're always calling me, asking me if I want some other job. I don't want some other job. So they think he's generated this. He thinks it's come out of the blue because he didn't mean to say to Goldberg if he wanted another job. He was just doing general complaint about life or whatever. So then Valenti told me that the president said, well, we've got to find something for him. All of a sudden, there is a vacancy at the UN. And so for whatever set of reasons, I don't know what was in the president's mind, but I mean, Valenti called up, you know, figures this is perfect, let's get Arthur Goldberg for this. Then the person who who also talked to me about it was Saul Linowitz, and who knew Lyndon Johnson very well. And he said Linowitz was at Adlai Stevens' funeral, and he saw the president, Lyndon Johnson, get off the plane with Arthur Goldberg, and he said to me at lunch here, he said, you know, the thought crossed my mind, my God, Arthur Goldberg is going to be appointed to the UN. So I asked Linowitz, you know, do you think that Lyndon Johnson promised him to be Chief Justice or some other thing? And Linowitz said he wouldn't have. Absolutely impossible. And Fran Gilbert, who was Arthur Goldberg's secretary, listened in on every call. She listened in at all the calls because they were making notes. When they had an official call of some kind, they made notes. And she told me that Lyndon Johnson never said anything about any promise. But Linowitz, this is Linowitz telling me, he says, it's quite possible that Lyndon Johnson could have said something like the following. Arthur, the most serious problem in the world today is Vietnam. And we have to settle this war. And the place to settle it is the UN. And you're the one who can do it. Now, Goldberg would have thought that was true. Because he was a great negotiator, and he knew it. All right, so then Linowitz to me, and Lyndon Johnson might have added, and you know, Arthur, the man who settles the Vietnam War can do anything. That's quite possible. That's quite possible. So what I've always thought, and then Moynihan said this is all consistent with what he has said, that Goldberg then decides to do this. But before he did, he talked to the Chief Justice, Earl Warren. And Justice Brennan told me this, that he and Arthur Goldberg and Earl Warren discussed this matter, and that he and Earl Warren thought that this is true, that if he could have a role at the UN that would lead to the settlement of the Vietnam War, that would be far more important for the country than anything that he could do here. And of course, I think that's true, if he could have settled it. So he thinks he can settle it. Moreover, I'll tell you another interesting thing about this. Moreover, this is speculation, of course. I can't. But he also would have thought that when he did anything whenever President Kennedy asked him to do anything, he always did it, and it always worked out fine. So he knows that. And then he said to us several times, he kept saying, this is all history. Are you embargoing this for a while? I don't want to get anybody into some...
It's up to you how long you wish to embargo it.
Well, until it's not going to create any problem.
But it's important to preserve it for history.
Yeah. All right, but I just say this is a view that I could be. All right, this is. He told us, Arthur Goldberg, several times. He said, Lyndon Johnson, he really likes me and he owes me something. He had the feeling. He said some things to us that made it seem that he thought Lyndon Johnson would want to help him or do something or listen to him or whatever it takes to solve the war. Because Lyndon Johnson, he had done something for Lyndon Johnson. And so we find out, what had he done for Lyndon Johnson? Well, when he was Secretary of Labor, and Lyndon Johnson, nobody was paying too much attention to apparently in the Kennedy administration, Arthur Goldberg, had a party for him with labor leaders. So I always thought, well, I don't understand why that's such a big thing. I don't understand. Then I read in a book that is the biography of Arthur Goldberg the following. That when Arthur, this is what it's an Oxford Press book. It's a
David
story.
Stebbin.
Yeah, exactly. It says that Arthur Goldberg, as Secretary of Labor, is asked by Lyndon Johnson to have a party for Lyndon Johnson, where Lyndon Johnson will meet a lot of labor leaders. So Goldberg says, fine. He says, but this really has a political implication here. I can't pay for this out of department funds. Don't worry, says Lyndon Johnson. I have a friend who will host the party, i.e. pay for it. And so Goldberg says, fine, okay, we'll have you can have the party and you pay for it, and it's a private party and we'll invite people. Okay, fine. Done. It then turns out that the name of the friend, which was unknown to anyone at that moment, but became known later, the friend who paid for the party has the name of Billy Saul Estes.
Oh, no.
That's right. Okay. So, yes. So, later on, by the time Goldberg is nominated to the Supreme Court
Oh my God.
Billy Sol Estes is well known because he'd been involved in all this fraud and so forth. And of course, Goldberg had never heard of him before, but now at this moment he is heard of, and he has paid for a party that Goldberg gave for Lyndon Johnson. And the only thing that could prevent Goldberg from being confirmed is if somebody brought that up at his hearing. And he knows that the senators do know about it. But nobody did bring that up at the hearing. I don't know that that would have been such, you know, I mean, could have told. But I can see why Goldberg would have thought that Goldberg, had really gotten himself in the potential difficulty in order to help Lyndon Johnson, though it was all inadvertent. Now do you see why he might have thought that Lyndon Johnson
owes him?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So in any case, he goes off to the UN and thinks that people really will listen to him and that he'll have a direct pipeline to the president and he will be able to resolve the Vietnam War, which of course he couldn't. And he wasn't listened to very much, and he eventually leaves, and then Johnson writes a biography how Goldberg had sought the job, and that infuriated Goldberg because Goldberg thought, but I never sought this job. It was him who tried to talk me into it. And he got so angry that he sent back to President Johnson at the ranch everything Johnson, all the souvenirs Johnson had ever given him.
Oh.
That's right. But you see, I can see now, having talked to Jack Valenti, how it's possible that they did think, because of Galbraith, that Goldberg was seeking a job. But Goldberg thought, I certainly was not. So you see the role of misunderstanding in that situation,
You
like
didn't.
many others.
Did you have a chance to talk to Professor Galbraith about this after
Yes.
Valenti?
Yes.
And what?
No, I talked to him first. I mean, Galbraith thinks that he did this whole thing. Galbraith thought that he's the one who is responsible, and we'd talk a lot. We belonged to this sort of lunch club up at Cambridge, and yeah, he talked about it a lot, actually. And he didn't have the whole picture. Nobody has the whole picture.
Well, that's the beauty of history. That's why you have to talk to a lot of
Yeah,
people.
yes,
I love the
yes,
fact that you
yes.
spoke to Justice Brennan about it.
Yeah, I was curious. I've always been curious.
So have I. My last question. Did you have a reflective?
Oh, by the way, wait. I just
more.
said he didn't solve. He did solve. You know, Arthur Goldberg wrote Resolution 242, and your memories can play tricks, but I think that he told me and Alan Dershowitz after that this language that caused so much difficulty. It says that Israel, something to the effect that Israel will withdraw from territories. It doesn't say the territories, or it doesn't say, well, I don't know if it's the word territories, it might be the lands. It doesn't say the, and so one side can say they promised to withdraw from all and the other side could say we didn't say all, and we didn't say we just said territories. It doesn't say how much. And that's very much I think that's very much negotiation language. Well, that was I think he was pleased that he got this settled on the basis of Resolution 242.
That's his language.
Yeah.
Territory.
I think so. I think I think that was the implication.
Last question. Did you have a chance, did you talk to Archibald Cox in a reflective manner about his experience after the president resigned? Did you talk about, when in 1974, did you have an occasion to talk to him about the president's resignation?
I may have, no. I would say I can't remember any conversation with him about that. I think I've talked. I would see him maybe fairly often. He was at Harvard, and I was there, and I would go into his office, and sometimes we would talk about different things. And I mean, it seemed to me obvious that he would think at this time he'd done his job, whether the president resigned or not. He did his job, and he did it well. That's simply it.
He seemed modest. Was he shocked? Was he embarrassed by all the public attention that?
No, I don't think he was embarrassed or not embarrassed. I think that the correct description of what he's like is, to me anyway, is what I've emphasized in public life or in your profession. Do the job as well as you can, and that's what he did. And if something good happens, fine. If something bad happens, then it does. But it's being a very, very good professional and being very honest. And he had common sense as well.
Where were you?
Oh, I know. The one thing he told me about this court, when he was Solicitor General, he said the way he wins his cases is he says the first thing you do is make the judges want to decide it your way. And then the second thing you do is you show them how they can do it. So, I mean, he's not, he is a practical person.
Well, he was alive to see you become a justice. He
Yes,
lived to see you.
yes. Yeah, I hope it pleased him. I think it did.
What do you remember of the day Richard Nixon resigned?
I don't remember it particularly. I'm sure like anybody else, I saw it on television and so forth. I mean, I know that he did. And I certainly read about it and read every word of it. And it was very interesting. And still the Watergate, we had a very good esprit de corps. And for years afterwards, the Watergate force would meet and have a kind of reunion. And I think the people in that organization, that's why even my little subpart, which was Joe Connolly, who was doing that, Richie Davis, I mean, I got to know them pretty well. And they continued that over the course long after I left. The other people who were there I knew pretty well too, quite a few of them. And we admired each other. And that kind of ethos, I think, has kept people together, and it's a nice group to belong to, because you feel proud of, I think, what the others did, and so it's stuck together.
Who were his closest advisors? Whom should we speak with about?
Well, you can't. The closest was Jim Borenberg, and he's not alive. He was a wonderful man. But I would talk to Phil Hyman, who was, I'd say, he and Jim were very close to Archie. I would talk to Phil, who's a wonderful person. He's up at Harvard now. He's teaching still in the law school. He's retired, but he teaches some.
Procedural question, why did the mandate include IT&T?
I'm not positive. I think it included ITT because there was some view that perhaps the break-in at the Watergate had something to do with an effort to get material that related to IT&T. There was a theory like that going on. If that was so, I never found out that was so. I don't think so. But anyway. Or maybe they just put in the unresolved mysteries. You'd have to ask the people who wrote the mandate why it was there, but it was there.
Justice Breyer, thank you very much. This has been wonderful.